He survived the mountains. He outran death. He faced storms that killed stronger men. But the one thing that followed him through every step was a pair of boots made by a woman no one noticed. 2 years later, when he came back to the town that forgot her, he realized the strongest things in life aren't made of steel or muscle. They're made by hands that mend what others throw away. The mountains had tested him in every possible way. He had crossed frozen rivers where one wrong step meant being dragged under the ice. He had climbed cliffs that tore the skin from his hands and forced his lungs to burn for air. He had run from predators that hunted silently, patiently, waiting for weakness. Yet standing at the edge of Fort Pitt, with the noise of the settlement rising around him, Levi felt a different kind of weight settle in his chest. He looked down at his boots. They were old now, scratched, darkened, scarred by years of hard use. The leather had softened with time, shaped perfectly to his feet. Every crease told a story, of storms, of fear, of survival, and every story led back to one person. She made these, he thought. 2 years had passed since he'd last walked these streets. 2 winters in the mountains, 2 summers beyond the tree line. Through it all, those boots had carried him safely home every time. Levi brushed his hand over the worn leather, almost unconsciously. He had trusted his life to these boots more times than he could count, trusted the hands that had stitched them together. Taking a slow breath, he tied his mules to a wooden post and stepped into the market. The place was louder than he remembered. Merchants shouted prices. Children darted between stalls. Faces had changed, but the energy felt the same, restless, sharp, shaped by survival. On the frontier, kindness was often seen as weakness. He passed stalls selling tools, food, and worn clothing. People glanced at him briefly, then looked away. He was just another mountain man passing through. Then he saw her. She sat in the same corner of the market, just as she had years ago. A small table, simple tools, no decorations to draw attention. Clara Hutchkins. Her head was bent over her work, eyes focused, hands moving steadily, needle through leather, thread pulled tight. Every movement calm and deliberate. She worked as if the world around her didn't exist. Levi stopped. For a moment, he forgot the noise, the people, the years that had passed. Watching her work stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he had never found in the wilderness. Peace. She didn't look up. She never did unless spoken to. Most people passed her stall without a second glance. Levi stood there longer than he meant to, studying the familiar lines of her posture, the quiet strength in her movements. She looked older, perhaps, tired, but there was something unbroken about her. He cleared his throat. "Miss Hutchkins." Her head lifted sharply. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Her eyes widened as recognition flashed across her face, surprise, relief. Something warmer she quickly tried to hide. Color rose to her cheeks as she lowered her gaze again. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly. "You're back." "I am," Levi replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I hoped," she hesitated, fingers tightening briefly around her work. "I hoped you made it through the winter safely." "Thanks to you," he said. He lifted his foot and slowly removed one boot, setting it gently on her table. "Your work held up better than anything I've ever owned," he continued. "I thought you might want to see how they fared." Clara stared at the boot as if it were something precious. She picked it up carefully, turning it in her hands. Her fingers traced the stitching she had done years ago. Despite 2 brutal years in the mountains, the repair was still perfect. The leather remained strong, the seams intact. "Oh," she breathed. Her face softened, the guarded expression she carried slipping away. For just a moment, pure joy shone through. "They did well," she said quietly. "You took care of them." "I did," Levi nodded. "I knew what they were worth." She smiled faintly. "Some men treat good boots like they're replaceable." "When something is made with care," Levi said, his voice low, "it deserves to be treated with care." Their eyes met. Both of them knew he wasn't talking only about boots. The air between them felt fragile, charged with something new, something unspoken, a possibility neither of them had named yet. And then, without warning, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Clara Hutchkins." The name was spoken with contempt. Levi turned, instinctively stepping closer to Clara's table as figures approached from the crowd. The past, it seemed, had not stayed buried. Every morning, before the market came alive with noise and movement, Clara Hutchkins was already awake. She rose before the sun, when the settlement was still quiet and the air felt clean and untouched. In the small room she rented behind a baker's shop, Clara lit a single lamp and prepared her tools. Needle, thread, awl, leather scraps saved carefully, never wasted. Waste was a luxury she couldn't afford. Clara wrapped herself in a simple shawl and stepped outside. The town of Fort Pitt slowly stirred around her. Doors creaked open. Smoke rose from chimneys. Another day of work was beginning. By the time the market filled with voices, Clara was seated in her usual place, the far corner, away from the busiest paths. It wasn't by choice. Years ago she had learned that people preferred not to notice her, so she made herself small and let her work speak instead. She bent over a cracked saddle strap, her fingers steady and practiced. Each stitch was precise, each repair strong. Men trusted her work even if they didn't meet her eyes. She heard the whispers sometimes. "She's quiet, that one. Good with her hands, though. Shame about her looks." Clara pretended not to hear. She always did. What people didn't see was the effort behind every piece she repaired. The long nights mending by candlelight, the pain in her fingers, the discipline it took to make something broken useful again. Leather spoke to her. She understood its limits, its strength, its weaknesses. Where others saw damage, she saw potential. When a man brought her torn boots or a cracked harness, she treated them with respect. Someone had relied on those things once. Someone might rely on them again. Around her, other stalls attracted attention. Bright cloth, loud laughter, practiced smiles. Margaret Whitfield's stall sat closer to the center, always surrounded. Margaret knew how to draw eyes. Sarah Brennan and Prudence Cooper lingered nearby, echoing her laughter. They rarely missed a chance to glance at Clara's corner with quiet disdain. Clara noticed. She always noticed. She also noticed when people were kind, when an old woman thanked her with tears in her eyes, when a child watched her hands in wonder. Those moments mattered. That morning her thoughts wandered, as they sometimes did, to a man she hadn't seen in 2 years, Levi Thornton. She remembered him clearly, the way he stood when he first approached her table, careful, respectful, the hesitation in his voice when she offered him the boots without payment. She remembered his surprise, his insistence, the way he looked at her as if he saw more than others did. She had told herself not to think of him. Mountain men came and went. They didn't stay. They didn't remember. And yet, a shadow fell across her table. Clara stiffened slightly, then looked up. There he was. Not a memory, not a thought. Real. Her breath caught before she could stop it. He looked older, thinner, stronger in the way only hardship could shape a man. "You're back," she had said, quietly. Now, as he stood nearby speaking with other traders, Clara tried to steady herself. Her hands trembled for just a moment before she forced them still. Focus, she told herself. But the market felt different now, smaller, closer. She stole a glance in his direction and caught him watching her again, not in the way others watched women, but with something softer, something patient. Heat crept into her cheeks. She looked down quickly, returning to her stitching. She didn't know what his return would mean. She didn't know why fate had brought him back into her path. What she did know was this: she had survived without being chosen, she had lived without being admired, and she had built her life one careful stitch at a time. Whatever came next, she would meet it the same way, quietly, with care, and without asking for more than she deserved. The mountains were never kind to men who underestimated them. Levi Thornton knew this better than most. Up there, far beyond the reach of roads or settlements, nature ruled with a quiet brutality. Snow could fall without warning, rivers could swell overnight. One mistake could cost a man everything. And yet, Levi kept going. Each morning began the same way. He pulled on his boots, tightened the worn laces, and felt the familiar weight settle around his ankles. The leather had molded perfectly to his feet over time, stiff where it needed to be strong, soft where it allowed movement. Those boots had carried him farther than he ever planned to go. They crossed frozen streams where ice cracked beneath his weight, the water below dark and merciless. They climbed narrow mountain paths carved into stone, where loose rocks shifted and fell away into nothing. They pressed forward through knee-deep snow, step by careful step, when turning back was no longer an option. More than once, those boots had saved his life. Levi remembered one night in particular. A sudden storm had rolled in as the sun disappeared behind the peaks. The wind screamed through the trees, tearing at his coat and blinding him with snow. Visibility vanished. The cold sank deep into his bones. He slipped. For a terrifying moment, gravity pulled him toward the edge of a drop he couldn't see. His boot caught on a jagged root, the leather holding firm against the rock. He lay there, heart pounding, breath ragged, until he found his footing again. When he finally made camp, hands shaking, he stared at his boots by the firelight. Good work, he had thought then. Someone knew what they were doing. That thought returned to him often. In the mountains, a man had time to think. Long hours of silence forced memories to surface whether he wanted them or not. And again his thoughts drifted back to a quiet woman in a market corner. He remembered the way she worked, careful, patient, never rushing. The way she offered those boots not as a bargain, but as a concern for his safety. No one else had done that for him. Most people admired strength when it was loud and visible. Clara's strength had been different. It lived in her hands, in her discipline, in her refusal to demand recognition. Levi had carried that with him as much as he carried his rifle or his supplies. Another time, deep in bear country, he had been forced to run. The ground beneath him was uneven, littered with roots and stones. His lungs burned as he pushed forward, trusting his footing without thinking. The boots held. He escaped, shaken but alive. Later, sitting alone, Levi had laughed quietly to himself, a sound rarely heard in the mountains. "If I ever make it back," he had said aloud to no one, "I owe her more than thanks." The mountains taught Levi how small a man truly was. They stripped away pride and pretense, leaving only what mattered. Up there, it didn't matter who noticed you. It didn't matter how you looked. What mattered was what held when things went wrong. As the seasons changed, Levi's path slowly bent back toward civilization. With every mile closer to Fort Pitt, his thoughts grew heavier, more certain. He wasn't returning out of convenience. He was returning because trust, once earned, deserved to be honored. And because somewhere between icy rivers and silent nights, he had realized something simple and undeniable. The strongest things in his life were not the ones that shouted for attention. They were the ones that carried him quietly, step by step, through the storm. Some moments stayed with a man longer than scars. For Levi, that moment lived in a quiet corner of a frontier market, years before the mountains hardened him. He remembered the hesitation in his own voice when he had first placed his damaged boots on Clara Hutchkins' table. The leather was split, the stitching torn, the soles worn thin from miles of unforgiving ground. He had expected a price. He had expected negotiation. Instead, Clara had studied the boots carefully, her fingers tracing the damage with practiced calm. She had looked up at him, concern in her eyes rather than calculation. "You're going into dangerous places," she had said. "Good boots matter." When she offered to fix them without payment, Levi had been stunned. On the frontier, nothing came without a cost. Kindness was usually a transaction, even when it pretended not to be. He had tried to insist. She had refused, turning back to her work as if the conversation was finished. That refusal had stayed with him. Over the following days, before he returned to the mountains, Levi found himself drawn back to her stall. He watched her work when she thought no one was paying attention. He noticed how carefully she treated every piece of leather, no matter how small the job. Some moments stayed with a man longer than scars. For Levi, that moment lived in a quiet corner of a frontier market, years before the mountains hardened him. He remembered the hesitation in his own voice when he had first placed his damaged boots on Clara Hutchkins' table. The leather was split, the stitching torn, the soles worn thin from miles of unforgiving ground. He had expected a price. He had expected negotiation. Instead, Clara had studied the boots carefully, her fingers tracing the damage with practiced calm. She had looked up at him, concern in her eyes rather than calculation. "You're going into dangerous places," she had said. "Good boots matter." When she offered to fix them without payment, Levi had been stunned. On the frontier, nothing came without a cost. Kindness was usually a transaction, even when it pretended not to be. He had tried to insist. She had refused, turning back to her work as if the conversation was finished. That refusal had stayed with him. Over the following days, before he returned to the mountains, Levi found himself drawn back to her stall. He watched her work when she thought no one was paying attention. He noticed how carefully she treated every piece of leather, no matter how small the job.
Not all eyes in the settlement looked at kindness the same way. As Levi stood near Clara's stall, a sense of peace settling in his chest, it shattered under the weight of a sharp, cutting voice. "Well, if it isn't Clara Hutchkins," Margaret Whitfield said loudly, her tone dripping with false sweetness. She approached with Sarah Brennan and Prudence Cooper trailing close behind, their laughter thin and rehearsed. Levi turned, his expression unreadable. Margaret's gaze flicked to Clara, then back to Levi. "Still hiding in this corner, mending scraps for charity cases?" she said, glancing deliberately at Clara's sturdy frame. "I suppose someone has to fix what proper people throw away." Clara's shoulders tensed. Her eyes dropped to the table. Years of practice had taught her that silence was safer than response. Levi felt heat rise in his chest. Margaret stepped closer to him, positioning herself between Levi and Clara. "Surely you aren't wasting your time here, Mr. Thornton. You deserve better company. Come see my cabin. It's far more welcoming." Sarah giggled. Prudence covered her nose as if something unpleasant lingered in the air. The market seemed to hold its breath. Levi did not raise his voice. He did not step back. Instead, he shifted slightly, placing himself beside Clara once more. "I'm exactly where I want to be," he said calmly. Margaret's smile faltered. I've crossed mountains that would break most men, Levi continued, his voice steady. I've survived winters that kill the careless and the cruel, and I've learned something important out there. The women watched him warily. Beauty fades, he said. Noise fades, but character, real character, endures. He looked at Clara then, not with pity, but with respect. This woman fixed what was broken without asking for anything in return, he said. She gave warmth to strangers. She worked with skill and quiet strength, while others spent their days tearing people down. Margaret's face flushed with anger. Levi met her gaze without flinching. If that makes her unworthy in your eyes, then I'm proud to stand apart from you. Silence followed. For the first time in years, Clara lifted her head, and Levi knew, whatever storms lay ahead, he would not step aside again. The church was fuller than it had been in years. People whispered as Levi stepped forward, his presence commanding silence without effort. Clara sat near the back, hands folded tightly in her lap, unsure why she had been asked to come. She felt small beneath the weight of so many eyes. Levi did not waste time. Clara Hutchkins's stall was vandalized, he said clearly. Leather destroyed, tools stolen, an attempt to drive her away. Murmurs rippled through the room. Levi raised his hand and the noise died down. 4 boys have confessed: Thomas Pritchard, James Wheeler, Samuel Cotton, and David Mills. The boys stood slowly, faces pale. Their parents stared at the floor, shame written across their expressions. But they did not act alone, Levi continued. They were paid. Gasps erupted. He turned toward the front benches. Margaret Whitfield, Sarah Brennan, Prudence Cooper. The named women leapt to their feet, outrage blazing across their faces. That's a lie, Margaret shouted. Why would we care about that woman? Levi's voice remained steady. Because you saw me standing beside her, and you couldn't bear it. Silence fell heavy. You are accustomed to attention, Levi said, to admiration, but I wasn't drawn to beauty or noise. I was drawn to character, to skill, to kindness. He looked back toward Clara. She has all of those. The truth settled like a weight in the room. When the meeting ended, consequences were decided. Apologies were demanded. Restitution was ordered. Clara sat frozen, overwhelmed. Levi crossed the room and stopped beside her. You don't have to stand alone anymore, he said quietly. For the first time, Clara believed him. Snow fell softly over Fort Pitt, covering old grudges and hard edges beneath a quiet white calm. Inside a small cabin at the edge of the settlement, warmth filled the air. Leather tools hung neatly along the walls. Boots lined the floor, mended, polished, cared for. Each pair told a story of survival. Clara stood near the table, shaping a piece of leather with practiced ease. Across the room, Levi adjusted the fire, glancing at her with a look that still surprised her. Not admiration, not ownership, something steadier. Home. You're still stubborn, Clara said lightly, a small smile touching her lips. Levi smiled back. Mountain habit, hard to break. She laughed then, the sound filling the cabin with warmth deeper than the fire. I never thought this life would be mine. Neither did I, Levi replied. But I'm glad it is. A small pair of boots sat near the doorway. Clara picked them up, examining the uneven stitches. Hope's been practicing again, she said. Levi chuckled. She'll get there. You saved my life once with boots like these. Only because you took care of them, Clara said softly. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains Levi once called home. But inside, nothing felt uncertain. The frontier had taught Levi how to survive. Clara had taught him how to stay. She had been overlooked, mocked, pushed to the margins. Yet here she was, strong, needed, loved. The girl they once scorned had found her mountain man. The trapper who lived for the wild had found his hearth, and the boots that had crossed endless miles stood quietly by the door, worn but unbroken, a reminder of a simple truth. The strongest bonds are not forged by beauty or passion, but by quiet courage, by hands that mend what is broken, and by hearts that choose to stay,